Olá.
Anna,
Fantastic. Wie geht's, meine Liebe?
super. Das nächste Mal in Berlin. We have a WhatsApp group which is called Berlin Forever, Anna, David, and I. It had a year to it, but we changed it. Oh.
Theresa, wie ist Anouk?
Sehr gut, sie läuft jetzt.
Oh.
Sehr groß. Erstaunt,
Can
wenn er
she,
kommt.
kann sie laufen?
Ja.
Ja, weißt du.
Okay. Wonderful. I think we can get started. The live stream is up, so we are all good. And I think as people might trickle in, might come a few more.
Perfect. All right, then let's get started. Welcome to the fifth event of our public conversation series, South Designs, Planetary Futures. My name is Kenny Coopers, and I just say a few words about the series. South Designs is part of a Swiss government-funded project called Governing Through Design, which supports critical and creative research on how design intervenes in everyday life worlds and planetary politics. And within this initiative, we launched a call for projects to explore how design, thought and practiced from the South, forges planetary futures. And to this call, over 150 teams from across the world responded, and a scientific committee helped us to refine our conceptual approach and select 6 of these projects for funding. And they've worked just a year and a half now on their various projects. And the link in the chat can give you an overview, Seppo, if you can get to that, of these projects and the teams behind them. Today's conversation series explores a community design for riparian ecologies, connecting designers, activists, and researchers from Sao Paulo, Jakarta, and Berlin. And they have a name called Designing with the Planet, which is a quite ambitious name that has brought their work together in these past months that they'll talk about today. We have one respondent, Lindsay Bremner, who I'll also introduce in a bit, to host this conversation. Since we have quite a lot of people on the call today, my bio mentions will be quite short in introductions, but you'll see them posted also on the chat for a longer read. Jamie Scott Baxter is an architect planner and a socio-spatial researcher, and he coordinates the Planetary Tactics for Cohabitation Lab within the project Rescaling Global Health at the TU Berlin. Laura Kemmer holds the Martius Chair for Sustainability and Humanities at the German Academic Exchange Service at the University of Sao Paulo. And she's an urban anthropologist and geographer working in Sao Paulo. Anna Luisa Nobre, please excuse my terrible pronunciation of names not familiar to me yet. She's a professor at the Department of Architecture and Urbanism at the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, and a researcher at the National Council for Scientific and Technological Development there, as well as a coordinator or co-coordinator for the Ground Atlas project, of which we have several members. David Sperling, who's an associate professor at the Institute of Architecture and Urbanism at the University of Sao Paulo, is also a coordinator of the Ground Atlas project. And he represents also Floating University. Yes. Got confused there. Teresa is the artist and activist who represents Floating University, which is a collective project in Berlin, a kind of nature culture site of learning in a rainwater detention basin in Kreuzberg, and we'll hear more about that particular site in a bit. Indira, who's also joined us. Indira Juliandra is an art producer who observes interrelations of humans, non-humans, and space, and will be speaking about making art in forms of drawing, painting, and installation. And her work is in Indonesia, Singapore, the Philippines, Taiwan, as well as Germany. Carla Lombardo is an artist, part of the Salve Saracura, an autonomous group in Sao Paulo, the purpose of which is the collective production of the city based on socio-cultural artifacts. And then finally, our respondent today is Lindsay Bremner. She is a professor of architecture and director of research and knowledge exchange at the School of Architecture and Cities of the University of Westminster in the UK. And of the many projects that she has led, I'll just mention the most relevant for our discussion today. It's called Monsoon Assemblages, a project funded by the European Research Council grant that examines relations between changing monsoon climates and rapid urban growth in 3 of South Asia's largest cities, Chennai, Delhi, and Dhaka. All right, so these are the people you'll hear about today that are going to join a conversation around the project entitled Designing from the Planet. And I just want to say a few words about the structure of our conversation today. So we'll start with a little introduction of about 5 or 10 minutes about this project, followed by a short response from Lindsay Bremner. And then we'll take time zooming into the 3 sites that concern this project. So in Jakarta, Berlin, and Sao Paulo, followed by another short response by Lindsay. And then we'll open for a discussion that will take its own flow for about half an hour, and then we'll open the floor for Q&A. All right, and with that, I give the floor to you, Jamie, Laura, and perhaps the others as well, collectively, to present your project. Thanks.
Wow, thank you so much, Kenny, for your very, very nice introduction, and thanks also to Laura and Cepo, of course, for organizing this. Special thanks really to Laura and Kenny for bringing up this initiative. It's been so gratifying in so many ways to be part of this project. So it's very nice to be here today, also with all the colleagues from Sao Paulo, Jakarta, Berlin, and also to have Lindsay Bremner as our guest, as our commentator today, and to get into a dialogue with her and all the audience, I believe, today. So I cannot see who is in the audience, but I'm crossing my fingers that some of the other projects are maybe present. We are very keen on discussing with them finally in October this year, I believe, when we all meet in Berlin. We have been very interested in several projects. We will have a visit by the Planetary Occupations Project here in Sao Paulo in a few weeks. We are always looking at the work of Caribe Mutu. We are very interested in. So there's already connections emerging across the South Designs Initiative, I believe. But without further ado, I will jump into the presentation because I have only 5 minutes. So how Jamie and I decided to split this in a rather classical way, because I'm always representing more the humanities anthropologist perspective and Jamie is representing the design perspective, is that I will talk a little bit about how our project connects to the planetary and also to the South in the South Designs Initiative, okay? And then Jamie will talk more about design practices. And then, as Kenny already announced, we have a second part where we will really have time to go into all the circulations across the sites represented in this project. Okay, next slide, please, Jamie. What I wanted to start off with is a little quote, which Jamie and I found in a more recent article by Ariel Roux and Yves Criton in a French journal called Multitude. And this is, of course, a quote that I'm quite curious about, because, as Kenny mentioned, my chair is called Chair of Sustainability and Humanities. And amongst many, many problems that arise with this term of sustainability, I find it quite interesting how the planetary is in many ways emerging also as a counter proposal, let's say, as a critical counter proposal to some terms circulating: globalization, sustainability, and so on. But what is actually the practices, and also the let's say design practices maybe, that planetary T points us to? And I really like this focus on habitability in this quote, because I think it's what our project is interested a lot also. So what we how we framed this since the beginning is around riparian zones, right? So zones that are inhabited by riparians of all kinds, by humans inhabiting riverbanks, inhabiting riparian zones, by plants, by animals, by waters, by grounds, and so on and so forth, and how these condition each other's ways of inhabiting beyond a specific geographical locale, how the interdependency within these riparian zones in Jakarta, Berlin, Sao Paulo comes to the forefront through this way of planetary thinking. Another thing that is interesting about the planetary is also how it always implies a decentering, right? So this has been argued a lot on the level of scales, on spatial, temporal scales, and also on the level of agencies. So there has been this hope, let's say, in planetarity, invested in planetarity as a way of thinking, of conceptualizing, that can overcome a binary between local and global, between human and nature. So this is a lot, of course, as Kenny also framed it, a lot in the ambitious title of our project, to design with the planet, right? To think to connect riparian zones beyond these binaries, right? And a last word, maybe also on this dualism between sustainability and the planetary. I think it's also interesting how sustainability often points us to solution-oriented way of thinking, to knowledge practices, and also design practices that have classically traveled from the global north to the global south, framed the global south as a kind of a lab where ideas from the global north can be tested, whereas this idea of the planetary really grounds, as Kenny and Laura had framed it also in their initial call, the answers, the experiments with habitability really in the experiences of those most affected by the devastations of our current time, by the climate crisis, and so on. Okay, so is there is this promise of overcoming binaries? Next slide, please, Jamie. But there is also more in this idea of the South Designs Initiative, which is very relevant to our project, because, as you will see, we are not working with locations that are geographically located in the so-called global South, but we also have Berlin amongst Jakarta and Sao Paulo in our project. So we really like how Kenny and Laura have framed this as the South as an ethos of engagement in their call. And this is something that points to something beyond the equality in the planetary, that goes beyond overcoming these classical binaries between local and global, between human and nature. Next slide, please. Because what it adds, the planetary, what it adds beyond this question of scale, is also a question of intensity. And this is something, the intensities of conjunction. I also borrowed this idea from the article that I cited in the beginning in the Multitude journal. But this is something we work with as a project a lot. So we are not simply interested in thinking riparian zones of struggle beyond, let's say, the local struggles in São Paulo, but we are also very much interested in the qualities and the intensities of the connections between these sites and how these emerge in our interactions, in our circulations. Jamie will talk more about it. So we also very much like this quote by Arturo Escobar, which we also quoted in our initial project proposal, where he proposes to overcome this idea, this dualism of the healthy with the unhealthy, and to think really about practices of healing. So this is something that is very central to our project. And we think this in a plurality of ways, of course, plurality of ways of healing. Next slide. And this, of course, relates back to authors like Spivak and Bembe also, who have emphasized from a feminist, from a post-colonial, decolonial perspective, the idea of vitality and of a politics of life really inherent or foundational to the idea of the planetary. And this is already where I will end with also, because I would like to give the ball to Jamie now with an open question maybe about the idea of planetary design really. So how or can even a planetary design recast elements like ground, water, riparian ecologies in our project as animated by the communities they sustain, but also as animating them, right? So how can we confront this through an idea of design? Okay, Jamie, I talked a little bit over time, but I hope it's okay.
Thanks, Laura. That's sort of what we would call a hospital pass in the UK, where you give me a very hard question to try and answer. Well, I'm not going to try and answer it, but what I will try and do is at least show you guys what we did, what our design proposal was, and maybe we can then speculate on how this might relate to the planetary a little bit. So, we had this idea to try and connect these different sites, these sites in Jakarta, in Berlin, and in Sao Paulo, these sites that are dealing with these kind of struggles around issues around water. Now, these issues and the struggles that they're facing are specific to the places that they're in, but they're also they have this a shared dimension to them as well. So we start to see this idea of the planetary, maybe within the local or within the site. So how do we kind of connect these sites, allow them to sort of build solidarities and build and share knowledge between the sites? Well, maybe let's say share knowledge in order to build solidarities and build relations between these sites, without erasing the differences within the sites, right? Because if you were thinking of the global local binary, then that's kind of what happens. As soon as you're sort of at the global scale, the local kind of gets lost, and vice versa. Maybe that's the argument, right? So we're trying to make these connections, build these connections. How do we do that? Well, we suggested we would create an infrastructure to do that. Now, of course, the budget was a little bit limited, and we didn't have the time needed to build a kind of an infrastructure spanning between Sao Paulo, Jakarta, and Berlin in the conventional sense. So we started to conceive of infrastructure or infrastructuring in a different way. This is what we just sort of developed, this idea of a self-organizing or a self-organized infrastructure. And the way that we would do that, the way that we would kind of make this infrastructure would be through performing it. So we would perform this infrastructure through the circulation of artifacts and people and stories and practices and knowledges. So we'll circulate these things, these objects, these objects that are inscribed with certain knowledges, with certain practices, and we would try and find ways to circulate them in different modes around these between these sites. And this was our hope, that this would somehow perform and materialize an infrastructure. I'm going to flick through a little bit because this is okay. Well, maybe I just can't resist to say at least what's happening on this slide. So this was a kind of a moment in Floating University in Berlin, where our colleagues from Jakarta joined us, And when they joined us, they brought with them this food specific to the mangroves that's made from mangroves and in the mangrove kind of location outside of Jakarta. So they circulated this food, and then we shared it in Berlin within the floating university. And as you can see, we had a good time and we started to get to know each other. So this was one kind of idea of gifting and hosting, which I'll come back to in a minute. Okay, so the self-organizing infrastructure. The question is, then, well, how does this become material? How do we materialize this? Because this is not only a discursive infrastructure, it's not only a knowledge infrastructure, but it has to be material, otherwise it's just a social network, right? So how do we materialize this infrastructure? This was the question that we asked ourselves. And really the kind of the answers starts to come through in these artifacts and the ways and the things that we share. So, for example, correspondences, we share letters. We wrote letters to each other and we circulated them. We wrote letters to the rivers, and the rivers wrote letters back to us. So we circulated these letters around between the sites and between in sort of embracing or kind of trying to perform different kind of like agencies within these sites through these letters. And this we found quite a productive way of starting to circulate. Then of course there's maybe more classical things like what we're doing now, these online meetings. We tried to sort of use this. We use Zoom. We kind of hacked these Zoom rooms and built sort of little structures in the Zoom rooms where we had online exhibitions, and we tried as hard as we could to make it as kind of tactile or as sensory as we might be able to, or as much as you can through a Zoom meeting, right? And then there's the classic website, which is coming soon. We're still building the website. Then there's a mobile exhibition. So all these artifacts, which you're going to see much more of in a minute. And they're circulating, and they're going to land in Berlin at some point, and we're going to make an exhibition in October on the back of the kind of the closing of the South Designs project. And our hope is that this exhibition, these artifacts within this exhibition, they will then circulate back to Jakarta and back to Sao Paulo. In July, we have a festival. We're planning a festival in Berlin, and where we're trying to we find ways through different funding applications and kind of leveraging this project to get more funding in order to circulate the people within the project. So this is another way of trying to keep these circulations going. And we're going to land in Berlin in July for a festival. Okay, so what do we mean by design in this case? I'm having to kind of race a little bit here, but you can see there's a kind of performative element to it, right? We're not talking about a classical idea of just simply representational design where we would do a drawing of a infrastructure and then 2 years later someone else, or 10 years later, in Berlin's case 15 years later, if you're building airports, then it would get kind of realized. But we're trying to perform these infrastructures through these kind of practices and through these circulations. We've talked about it being planetary, so these are things, it's working with ideas that are embedded in sort of sites but have planetary consequences on one hand. On the other hand, we're trying to find ways to make relations across the planet. There's an anti-colonial kind of sentiment here, right? Because of course we can see clearly that this idea of collecting objects and artifacts has got a kind of history of coloniality, right? But the difference is that these objects are shared and built and created together and gifted with consent and circulated with consent. So there's a difference between, and this is conscious, and we can talk more about that later. And they're tactical, these are tactics. They're trying to do specific things. They're situated practices, and they're also arrangements of kind of assemblages, which is also what the word tactical kind of, or tactic kind of implies. But they're specific and they're against particular struggles. So there's a kind of political kind of desire in here, or a form of resistance perhaps. And then we started to kind of try and categorize and think about what are our tactics, what are our planetary tactics for design, or planetary design tactics. Well, I'm going to run through these quickly, and they're going to come back to them later, and you'll see examples of them. But keep in mind this idea of evidencing, and evidencing works against or resists the idea of concealing and obscuring. Remixing or reconstituting, this works against the idea of reducing and abstracting and simplifying. Gifting simply works against the idea of extracting and taking and stealing. Hosting works against the idea of parasiting and becoming a parasite, or parasitical forms of relations. And you'll see examples of these in a minute. So in terms of the learnings, I think I will save that. If we have time later, we can come back to it. And instead, I'm going to hand over to my colleagues to talk a little bit more concretely. Oh no, we're going to hear from Lindsay as a response, right?
Shall I go, Kenny? Yeah?
Yes, sorry, please,
Great.
go
Okay.
ahead.
Thanks so much, Laura and Jamie. I mean, just listening to you and your enthusiasm and the way you describe your project, it's really inspiring. I just want to say that from the start. But I'd like to kind of offer, just as an initial response, four provocations, okay? And the first one is that I see your project as an ecofeminist one that really is about care and repair for damaged ecosystems, damaged bodies, damaged soils, waters, airs, and so on. But what I also think is important is that it is also bringing an ecofeminist critique to theories of planetary urbanism. And, you know, in order to rethink and repoliticize them. So I'd like to hear you talk more about this and how you see this working, this sort of ecofeminist aspect of your project. The second thing that you haven't really spoken about is about the idea drawn from Boaventura de Sousa Santos and Arturo Escobar about the importance of knowledge produced in struggle, okay, as an epistemology of the South. So how is your project supporting the struggles that you have identified and are engaging with? You know, how is that actually working in practice? And then I think the two things that you did focus on in your brief introductions were the idea of the planetary and the idea of this infrastructure of connectivity and circulation. And on that, I would love to hear you talk about the challenges that building this infrastructure faces in a very practical sense. Questions of language, okay, questions of continuity, questions of what getting together does in producing emissions through travel. You know, I mean, I think there are a lot of quite maybe unanswerable questions that I'd like to hear you talk about a little. And then finally, so there are four things that I'm just flagging up that might come up in later discussion, is the idea of the planetary that you have so eloquently described, Laura. And I think, but what I'm kind of sensing that maybe you need to push a little bit more, or I'd like to push you a little bit more, is how thinking with the planet actually can become a mode of design, which is kind of what we tried to do with monsoon assemblages. And, you know, given that the planet is always out of sync with itself, it's never settled, it's never final, it's always uncertain, it's always interdependent. Like how that idea of thinking with the planet, not in a scalar sense, but in a processal sense, how you can draw on that for your project. So, I mean, those are my initial reactions, and thanks so much for I kind of thought about those before, but really I think they've tapped into some of what you said already. So thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. I think these are fantastic provocations for the larger discussion also. Perhaps I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but if in talking about the specific sites, which you'll do next, the team might also already, you know, feel free to respond, of course, to any of these provocations. Otherwise, we'll pick up on them later.
Thank you. That sounds great.
So it's over to Indira, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, to introduce everyone from the sites.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Hello. So I am Indira. I am the one who's working with the Labtech Apung in Jakarta. So I think we're going from Jakarta, Berlin, and Sao Paulo. I'll be briefly quickly explain about what Labtech Apung is. So we are a transdisciplinary research collective based around Jakarta, Indonesia. It's around Jakarta because not everyone live in Jakarta, and we are working to understand water through different perspectives. So, for example, I have a background in design and art, and then there are anthropologists, architect, chemist, and also wash engineer in the team. So we try to get more dialogues about water in our team. And now we are working in the estuary of Citarum River, close to Jakarta, the previously capital city of Indonesia. And this is where we unfold things, and also things that we are happy to share with our friends in Floating and also in Salve Saracura in Sao Paulo. And I am going to quickly call my friend Teresa and also Carla to introduce the site, and then I'll get back to the artifacts that we will be talking about after our introduction.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Indira. Oh, please go back again. Thank you, Jamie. So my name is Teresa. I will quickly introduce the project Floating University Berlin. We are actually not a real university, but a learning site indeed. We are an art project situated in a functioning technical infrastructure, a rainwater retention basin that was built to serve the former airport in Berlin Tempelhof. It is a basin, an asphalt basin where nature developed over the years, especially a big reed belt. And that made us read this pond as a hybrid site, not only a technical infrastructure, but also a biotop. And after Raumlabor Berlin initiated a Campus for Cities and Transformation in 2018 as a temporary project, a group formed and an association was initiated that is now taking care of the site, keeping it open, and also avoiding that other plans are realized, like building sport fields. And we also co-live and co-create with humans and non-humans arriving there. I think this is it for now.
Thank you, Teresa. Perfect. And then we'll move to Sao Paulo.
Thank you. I am Carla from Salve Saracura Collective. We are an autonomous collective, and we are located in a valley. This neighborhood preserves a topography of green riverbanks, hillsides, and small houses that is known as the Grota do Bexiga. And one of our efforts has been to preserve these green areas and the Saracura River water spring, which are already protected by law, but suffer from continuous deforestation due to real estate speculation and verticalization in the area. Thank you.
So should I continue with the artifacts? Okay, thank you. Okay, so these are a few pictures of some artifacts that we tried to collect during our first offline meeting or first encounter in persons in Sao Paulo last year. And personally, for me, it really opened up possibilities and also gives more inspiration to think about ways of exchanging and also ways of introducing each other's issues, each other's knowledge, and just to get the conversations going. So what we thought what artifacts can do is that we try to bring things and introduce things to each other about the stories of our relationship with water, because that's what connects us differently. So we try to tell the stories about how water connects us, or how we connect with the water, or how some certain things, moments, situations reconnect us with water. And also we try to share about the different kind of knowledge that we learn from each site. It's obviously very specific, very different approaches. And then we share through things that we try to bring here. For example, we try to smuggle a few things like seeds, water, things that are supposedly illegal to bring outside the territories. But it's very interesting how water, that we think that it's something that live with us every day, and then we put it inside this very simple plastic bottle, and we bring it to other place, and then we introduce it, and it becomes something very special. So it's plain water, but it becomes something very special as a story, and it keeps the dialogue going. And then also there are artifacts that is made from the children in Berlin. And this is also something that's very interesting for the children in Sao Paulo. And there's also seed bombs and reeds. There are some reeds, and also we definitely brought some foods from Jakarta. And also about making, understanding, we also brought tools, introducing those tools to other places. That's how we try to understand what's going on in each places. So, and also this kind of circulation when we get back. For example, I can only say it from the LabTech's perspective. When we get back to Jakarta and we tell the people that, oh yeah, we tell stories about this place to other people, like from the other side of the world, and it makes it brings positive impact and also confidence for the people to keep whatever they do, and that's a really good impact. And it becomes like an ongoing conversations about proof, about what takes form of each stories, and also ask more people to be the witness of the situations that everyone is experiencing. I think that is a very good way of understanding this project, to help others understand and become another witness of the project, and maybe think of something else. And there are more artifacts that I think Carla is best to explain about that, because it's actually happening. It was happening in Sao Paulo about the seeds, the mask, and a lot of things. So maybe we can continue with the next slide with Carla.
Thank you, Indira. As I mentioned before, one of our efforts has been to preserve these green areas and the Saracura River water spring. So we created the Seed Bombs workshop in this context. The small balls were made by a mixture of clay and earth with seeds from trees and plants from the Atlantic forest. I would like to comment on this issue because many people from other territories and collective gave us seeds. Last October, during South Design meeting in São Paulo, we met Neidi from the Casandoca Quilombo community, Casandoca Maroon, who gifted us seeds from the Atlantic forest that her community has safeguarded. Also, our friend Jacinto from the Bexiga community garden brought seeds from trees and plants which were collected between Bexiga and Cambuci districts. Maybe we can go to the masks. We also created a multi-species bear mask, Saracura bear masks. And I will make that. I will put the mask. Together with the kids, we made some Saracura masks. Saracura is a bird. It's very important for Bexiga and also connect us with the neighborhood's history and other territories, such as Yarawa indigenous land, also located in the city of São Paulo. The mask was originally created in 2020 by our collective in order to protect our privacy in the social medias and also used in a carnival parade in 2020. And in this workshop, we update its use for the kids to map the territory as Saragura birds. And the map flag, the next slide, please. Thank you. We created also a map that is a flag to read and leave the territory. It's important to mention that in addition to creating the map, it is important to create the community that reads the map. Thank you. I think now Teresa or Indira.
Yes, I will continue. Thank you very much for sharing our encounter, also with the pictures. I have some minutes. I will try to wrap up also what we thought from the beginning when it was not clear that we will meet in person at any moment. We were thinking a lot how to, of course, evidence and collect those exchanges, right? And yeah, we realized that archiving what we do and where we have where we work maybe similar might be a way, and also, yeah, to really show what are the struggles. So maybe also the question that Lindsay, you brought up first, or I think for me and Ute, who were in this exchange in Sao Paulo, we found out that listening to each other is a first step, and we also recorded, like really recorded. We did interviews with a lot of people there, and our idea is to publish this, which is maybe also our possibility in Berlin to use our platforms that we have to be the repository, but in the same time, we thought bringing everything to Berlin might not be in this context, be the right thing, but then continue to maybe first collect everything in Berlin and then bring it again to Sao Paulo and Jakarta, which is maybe, indeed a question for the future also, how to continue after this first exchanging and networking and making really strong connections. I think this is also somehow evidencing that we are now in contact, and how we are in contact. I think this is it for now. Here you can see again also the graphic recording of our first meeting that we had online.
Great, thank you so much. I think we get a very concrete idea here of what you've called what Jamie called the planetary design tactics that the project involves. Lindsay, I don't know if you want to respond directly to these things, or they might also allow you to answer your own questions in part, perhaps. Let's see.
Thanks, Kenny. I mean, great to see the projects actually, what they're actually doing, and what they're bringing together and what they're producing. I think what struck me from all of the projects was how many of them are working with children. I mean, this seems to be a common theme, not only with children, but children seem to be an important participants in the projects, which I find super interesting, actually. But I suppose what hasn't been answered by what's been presented is what the struggles are external to what you're doing that you are supporting, or what is the concept of struggle here? In a case of the project I'm just completing, which is the struggle for the eco-restoration of a creek, another riparian environment in Chennai. We tapped into an ongoing struggle that's been going on for 20 years. And the project was led by the activists and the fishing communities. So I suppose for me, what's not clear, who are the external parties whose struggle you are tapping into in each of these cases? Or maybe that's not a relevant question, but it seems to me that, you know, this idea of knowledge struggle seems to me to be quite an important underlying concept that's driving your project. Yeah, I mean, I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know who'd like to respond to that. I don't want to point out people all the time. So if that's okay, I'll leave it to you just from the collective to go ahead. Otherwise,
yeah.
Laura.
Shall I give it a little start and then you continue, please? But because I hosted this workshop in Sao Paulo that many of the pictures are taken from, maybe I can explain a little bit about how the notion of struggle got refined also. I mean, how we exchanged actually across the sites about what we are struggling against and for, I would say. No? One thing that I find very important, because Lindsay also pointed to this, and I, of course, as a feminist myself, I really like that you identified our project as the ecofeminist project. What I find very interesting, also because you mentioned the critique of planetary urbanization, which I would very much see as a critique of abstractions, also of actually something that does not capture as a conceptual approach, as a theory, the vitality and also the dynamics, so that in a way also sometimes repeats this dualism of inert and organic matter and so on. And I have this feeling, and please, Indira, Teresa, Carla is not present anymore, but I can tell a little bit from Sao Paulo, and also Anna and David know a lot about this case from the ground atlas perspective, from the mapping perspective. What is a struggle against is really a struggle against this idea of the urban as making people become distanced from vibrant matters, from vital matters like sediments and soils and waters and riparian ecologies and Sarapura birds and so on. So there is a strong struggle, which I also see at the floating, defying these dualisms of nature culture, which I also see at the LabTech, where it's a lot about rekindling relations. So the bird mask has become a monkey strategy of mapping and so on. So it's really about healing in the sense of making whole, of repairing relations also that have been attacked between humans and ecologies, riparian ecologies in a broader sense. It's also a lot about restoring. There we would be coming back to Escobar, but maybe also more prominently Sylvia Winter's idea of storing. Because what I really like, in for instance, ideas of care from philosophers like Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, is this connection between epistemology and practice in care. So what we think of soil also informs the way we care for it, and vice versa. So through the restoring, we can also bring together actually the ethical, the political, the epistemological, the practical in these relations. And I think this is really important. Yeah, I didn't mention the concrete struggles. There could be a lot more to be said about maroon communities, about histories erased, about real estate speculations, verticalization, impermeabilization. But I would leave it to my colleagues also to go into detail. or come back to it later.
Anna, please jump in.
Yes, please. Just very briefly, Lindsay, I love your comments, your reactions, and the site. I was looking at your site right now. It's so beautiful, the Monsoon exhibition. But to answer very quickly to one of your provocations, I think the big struggle is the fight for the grounds. It's in Berlin, it's in Jakarta, and in Sao Paulo, and in India and elsewhere. So when I say ground, I think of a polysemous words that has to do with land, that has to do with soil, that has to do with territory, but it's also a word archive, and it's a living organism. So when we were looking at Bexiga, we were working for the first time together in Bexiga. We were talking about processes of urbanization, of colonization, of modernization, pressures by the real estate markets, but also a process of erasure of narratives, erasure of Black culture, Black movements. So when we brought some indigenous people, for instance, into the workshop, into the era, we also brought some new questions. So, you know, we're also raising questions, and I think that's the challenge of mapping, or at least what we consider mapping. It's not actually mapping the territory, of course, but mapping relationships, mapping also possibilities, and turning critically visible relationships that are not always, we can always feel them or touch them or see them. So that's my contribution.
Thank you so much, Anna. Indira, you want to add to that?
A little bit about the perspectives in the struggles, because I think from what we learned during this collaboration is that sometimes when we are very close to the struggle, we cannot see what is really going on. And by working together, sometimes it really helps us to, take a step back and see what's really going on, and or your friend helped you to see from the other sides, helps you to just walk a little bit further and see what is really going on. So yeah, it's very abstract, but I think that concludes everything that we've been doing so far. Teresa, you want to continue?
Yes, and also to get inspired and to come back with new energy for their own struggles, let's say. At least that was my experience in this exchange.
Jamie, please jump in. Or as an accidental hand.
Me, I'm coming. I just didn't unmute myself. Thank you. And Lindsay, thank you for your comments. These are great provocations, and yeah, I really thought-provoking, and I wouldn't be able to respond to them all. And I'm not going to now respond specifically to the struggles, because I think that's really best placed with it from my colleagues who've already made an attempt to talk about that. But I wanted to kind of come back to some of the other topics that you brought up a little bit earlier. I mean, maybe what we could talk about it as a struggle, which was like the struggle of how we collaborated in this kind of constellation. And you mentioned language, you mentioned continuity. I think you mentioned emissions, which is a very good point. Another one that you didn't mention, which was a sort of thing that we had to overcome, was the time zones and time differences, and finding ways to meet that didn't mean that our colleagues in Sao Paulo had to get up at like 6 in the morning, or, so these were small kind of like considerations that we had to do, and we had to find ways of shifting that. It was maybe, I mean, in fact, sitting in Berlin, it was always quite easy for us because we were always kind of in the middle of the day, But like it was a consideration. And then with the language, again, we tried to set aside resources to ensure that any of the kind of protocols or the publications would be translated, and that we could try and start developing a glossary that might have different languages within it, and starting to try and take terms and take words that were maybe prevalent in certain languages, and maybe sort of translating them and transforming them, adapting them towards towards what we wanted to do, So, and that brings me on to another point, which is you mentioned Santos de Souza's work and Escobar, and and you know, in his epistemologies of the South, he talks about, if I remember rightly, he talks about two aspects. One is like kind of relying on different forms of knowledge, and sort of the hybridity of bringing these together, to bringing together different kind of like different knowledges. So that could be scientific knowledge with more kind of everyday, I think he calls it local knowledges. So this idea of hybridity was kind of central, I suppose, and that's kind of exemplified in this idea of trying to kind of like remix these words, these kind of languages, and trying to kind of give them other and new meanings, you know, and that would then inform our glossary, which we're still kind of working on. So yeah, that kind of, yeah, that hybridity is important, and maybe and sort of that going back to our tactics, you know, this idea of hybridity or remixing or mingling was a sort of resistance to this idea of abstraction and simplification. And I know that now we're still talking at a more abstract level, but I think you can sort of see, you know, maybe a concrete example that we didn't quite touch on, or it was implicit in the presentation, was some of these practices like the masks. You know, we did these workshops in Sao Paulo to do with masks and to do with stories, and then they were brought back to floating. And I mean, and our colleague Uta, who couldn't unfortunately make it today, she did a beautiful workshop again with children, which was then she told the stories to children in Berlin about the birds in Sao Paulo, Saracuya, and also about the monkey from LabTech. And then drawings kind of emerged in this workshop made in Berlin about these kind of hybrid kind of forms of bird and monkey. That, you know, so it was retelling these stories, and the stories getting transformed and translated and remixed into a new kind of artifact. And so I think that kind of idea of hybridity and hybrid knowledges, and then of course D'Souza Santos also mentions the kind of the democratization of how knowledge is then transmitted and transferred, and of course we can see that within our idea of trying to circulate these there we are, Laura, thank you. These yeah, these kind of like these inscriptions, you know, with different kind of languages. So yeah, I just wanted to react to that, but thank you again for your provocations, Lindsay.
Thank you so much. And if I may just add my own question to that with regards to Lindsay's question about struggle. If, as you had mentioned already, a lot of these areas, riverside areas and cities tend to be home to low income and marginalized communities, and sometimes in quite dense communities. And then riverside rejuvenation projects often entail the dispossession of those communities in the name of ecology, right? In the name of restoring and healing. And so many of the terms you could say you've used could also be used for in the name of projects that actually are about dispossession, right? So I wonder what in a nutshell would be, you know, the alternative you offer in terms of a kind of planetary ecology. I mean, I see a lot of links already. Maybe I'll help you answer that question. You know, I think I see healing, of course, not as the state or return to like a natural state, right? A kind of idealized ecology, but rather a much more imbricated nature, human ecology, etc. Maybe that's one thing. Another possible answer is also the methods you use, right? Rather than these conventional methods of master planning huge areas, you've proposed very different design tactics. But please.
Can I just add to that? I mean, just listening to you all talk about struggle, it seems to me that part of this is your own struggle, you know. It seems that there's a kind of real reflectivity and an attempt to struggle with the binaries and the inheritances that we've all kind of received from our education and from our, you know. So there's an internal struggle, which is really, really important and groundbreaking, actually. But then I think what, for me, I mean, it relates to what Kenny's just said, like the importance of connecting that to real political struggles. You know, not that I'm saying your struggle as a group is not real, it's very real. But, you know, the kind of reality of political struggles on the ground and how the methods that you've developed developing, of storytelling, of people, telling stories of their cultural attachments to place, bringing objects, how that can engage with political struggle in really effective ways. That's what I'm kind of interested in. And I think it's possible, it's just, how do you get there? Maybe you have, but I haven't heard that yet.
Laura.
Yeah, maybe I can quickly share from what we already did in São Paulo. And I would also really like to point out what we are planning to do, because you also mentioned continuity. I think that is really important to remember that actually what we have been doing mostly is piggybacking, right? I mean, during the South Designs project, because what it helped us fund concretely were in the case of São Paulo, for instance, materials, like very concrete things we needed for the workshops, but all these circulations in a broader sense, we have piggybacked on other fundings to bring us together and to circulate all these tactics and knowledges. So what we're really wanting to do is actually to build a longer term connection between our sites, to continue what Indira has been talking about so nicely. But what I wanted to say in terms of struggles, so yes, I agree a lot with you, Kenny. I think that is a very interesting, I would say, productive challenge and conflict, that there is actually large scale practices and framings around healing and repair in an idea of a fix, renaturalization, all these crazy ideas of you can go back to a state of a pure nature or a healthy environment or whatever, right? We are, of course, much more believing in that we are inhabiting already a broken planet and are trying to, exchange practices of habitability, let's say, in this context. So against this idea of the fix, but still keeping, for instance, a lot of this thinking about reparation, for instance, that is something that in São Paulo is very important in the context of a local Quilombo movement that is actually fighting against erasure of memory around the riparian community that this Quilombo was. This river here was also inhabited by indigenous peoples for a long, long time. It was even an important path of resistance for indigenous peoples who came into the city along the river to fight the colonizers. So actually resistance is a very important theme in São Paulo, and we have invited the activists from Berlin and Jakarta also to learn from the strategies of resistance, because as Teresa put it, it's a very powerful case actually, and we don't have to invent anything. People are already very, very visible, both in fighting for the memories and winning fights also for this preserving or visibilizing the memory of the Black movements in the neighborhood. People are very powerful in fighting, and this is Salve Saracura collective represented by Carla before, fighting against real estate speculation. So they're mobilizing the rights of the river to prevent new buildings and verticalization in the neighborhood. Also many successful cases in the past years. So we are not activating these kinds of struggles. They are already happening. What we are doing is we are learning from each other to replicate or to bring these stories to other places, right? I think this is really, there have been very powerful moments, despite, the more than 30 languages that Anna mentioned that have been talked. Only, I think, 3 or 4 indigenous languages from all over the world within our workshop. And still we have been doing public events, have translated our stories. We have been doing an event in the Museum of Indigenous Cultures in São Paulo. So we have been quite, I would say, quite visible in our work here, and of course want to continue to circulate exactly this. And for this, and there I hand over to the more experienced people with design also in our group, because for this we are really thinking about this mobile exhibition that we want to circulate, to travel along with us, right? And this is not thought as something that causes more emissions because it needs to travel, like a physical object that needs to travel from one side to another side. But it's more thought as a, how do you always call it, Jamie? A protocol, right? That can be that can be somehow documented, and then someone takes it. So for the mask, we have like a list of ingredients, and then you do it again in Berlin. But I don't have to bring the mask to Berlin, of course.
David, you should.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay, for your comments and very powerful questions for our project. When you say something about struggles, I guess we need to pay attention, even or most from the South, because somehow we can romanticize what is a struggle, and we have in these situations really profound struggles. Working and on the ground and under the ground. And I guess the question is the right of existence. A lot of people don't have the right of existence. And this is connected with another concept that is the environmental justice. When we could connect here in the South some actions or public actions or governmental actions that use the green movement to move power people. And then we can connect movements that are that cannot be thought even in or on a progressive politic way, as we saw in the last five years in Brazil, when we saw a necropolitics going on, not only for humans, but for non-humans too. And to think about necropolitics is not to think about only humans. And even when we started in this project with in the workshop, we learned a lot from indigenous people when they confront us about our infrastructures, but not only our super or infrastructures, but our subjectivity. And then when you taught us about is not only an internal struggle, I guess it's interesting to think about this system that infrastructure produce subjectivity produce infrastructure, and how we can put alternative access in counter-production of subjectivities and infrastructures.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really important point about romanticizing struggle and better understanding. Jamie and Indira, do you want to respond to this point? I'd like to also bring in respond to that, but I'll wait. Go ahead, Jamie.
Sorry, I'll be quick. I just really wanted to kind of highlight exactly what you were highlighting there, this idea of romanticization, and we're sort of looking maybe for this big struggle, this grand struggle and this grand political move. But I wonder if we're thinking more about if it's more about the everyday struggles and more about the kind of micro struggles. Is the struggle here, and in some of the cases they're very subtle. It's like this kind of constant, in one case it's about this constant threat of being evicted. One of our groups, there's this constant sort of looming, there is a struggle every day to try and make enough money to know that the project's going to survive. And then there's a kind of threat of eviction in the background. And that struggle is valid, but it's hard to, it doesn't have the same scale or the same kind of, prominence perhaps as other ones. And I mean, I'm sort of thinking off the cuff a little bit here, but I know what's happened through the project is by talking about that and by hearing about other struggles that are happening elsewhere. And it's a point that Indira made really very nicely earlier about seeing from other perspectives. And really, the point of the project was about this idea of building relations and about building solidarities. And that's kind of these things are so subtle and nebulous, right? But I feel like, and it's hard for us to quantify that or to kind of measure it in any way, but somehow there's, at least within the group, there's this feeling of solidarity, there's a feeling of support, there's this feeling of being heard and being witnessed and witnessing the struggle that either some of us in the group are actually having to bear, or others in the kind of wider network are kind of the everyday struggle. Like maybe even Indira, I don't know, you had your hand up, you should definitely talk maybe about the sites and about what's happening with the monkeys and the kind of the contestations within that scenario. That would be fantastic to hear. But yeah, I stopped. Thank you.
Yes, that's exactly what I was going to talk about, because it's something that I think we all learn from this connection, is that aside from the struggle that us human have been suffering and also learning from each other, is that this point made us realize that the political struggle is actually not just between humans and also between non-humans. We were talking about the birds, the water, the primates, the trees, and that's how we try to learn. How do we work with them? That's a really big question. It's something that is definitely not easy. How do we, I mean, even languages between humans, it's something that we take time, and we definitely cannot speak every language in this world. And now we are trying to include non-humans to this struggle, and then we try to speak on behalf of them. And it's something that's very, very dangerous to do, because obviously we're not them. And how do we, learn to think of this as our political agendas together between humans and non-humans? Yeah, I think that's for me. And maybe Kenny.
Yeah, thank you so much. Maybe not quite related to the non-human human relationship, but going back to the contradictions. David, you mentioned this, the right to existence, and I'm thinking about marginalized communities who don't have title deeds on land that is also constantly shifting and unstable, but where aspirations for a better life also mean a solid wall, or a kind of a permanent structure to live in. And of course that does raise the question then of its relationship to the unstable ground on which these dwellings are erected, and not to try and legitimize here the dispossession that goes together with some of these eco projects, these massive eco projects, but perhaps that there is a tension between this aspiration of the right to existence and to dignity and to a proper house, right, which is often seen as a sign and an achievement of dignity. How that sits in tension with fragile, unstable ecologies, and the way you've engaged with that in your project. So if I can just push you a little bit on that tension.
I think you were directing that at David, weren't you?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't assign anybody, but anybody feel free to respond. But yes, David, as you had mentioned, the necropolitics, I think that might respond to that.
Yeah, in this Saragura area, this question is not so present. This question about under people under rights to live and so on. But we have not for habitation, but we have about what Anna said, that is the right of the memory, right of the narratives. And if you have like black communities that were erased, and the forms of living were erased. You can't not pass to the future alternative ways of living, you know, and then you have only the Occidental way of living that is a form of coloniality, you know.
Yeah, I was wondering if we can bring in Lesego Bancheng's question, Laura. Would you want to bring that in?
I since we are already in this Q&A kind of flow, so Lesego is from our Rural Futurisms team, another South Designs project, and they are doing some really fascinating work around mycelium and kind of rural knowledge systems and traditions and artifacts as well. So I think there's a lot to connect on, and she's asking around the notion of gifting as a form of decolonial querying, very interesting. But she's also asking, within this framework of the planetary, she's curious about how you consider different types of gifts, and particularly, and maybe you just want to clarify this, the seeds across different ecological habitats and taking them across different ecological habitats, taking into account the historical complications of invasive alien species as contributors to ongoing ecological disruptions affecting, amongst many other things, water systems, right? So I'm sure you've thought through that. But I'll leave you to answer this question live. I think it's a fascinating question. Yeah, Laura.
Wow, yeah, it's a fantastic question. Thank you so much for this question. So, well, I can just give you one example, which will not solve, I think, the tension inherent in the practices of traveling seeds. And I should also mention it's not something that we have designed necessarily. It's something that that happened through, yes, this idea of gifting, which was very prominent in our project and which multiplied in many ways. So we had the food giftings, but then when I remember, and maybe Teresa and Indira want to add from their memories from our first preparatory meeting for the São Paulo event, because Teresa and Indira were present, and also Ute from Floating, how this came up with the idea with the seeds. But what I wanted to mention is another guest we had at our São Paulo event was Maria Teresa Alves, who is actually an artist who from Brazil, who worked a lot with seeds and soils in Berlin. And this is also why we invited her. She was it was actually not an add-on on emissions, but she was already in São Paulo. So we just thought we'd invite her, and also actually a team of artists. She's collaborating with indigenous artists. So this is how, amongst others, also 3 indigenous people came to our workshop and collaborated with us. So what Maria Teresa has been doing in Berlin is actually, she has been retracing the travels of seed to retrace also colonial histories, in particular the violent histories of colonial Germany, the wars in Namibia and other African countries. She has been speculating on how these seeds actually came to Berlin on the boots of the soldiers that fought in these wars, and so on and so forth. So Berlin has a very interesting history of people working on, of artists, academics, all kinds of people working on soils as also a way of questioning or disrupting these stories of the pure, of the nation state, where the migrant and so on and so forth. And I think this connects I haven't thought it through completely yet, but I think it connects to the idea of the planetary in a very interesting way, actually, to counter also these ideas of how sometimes the idea of the invasive is also connected to the idea of the invasive migrant and so on. So these very problematic connections that also presume this purity. What we know is actually just what I can add to the case of Sao Paulo. There's been this wonderful work of Malcolm Ferdinand on decolonial ecologies, which has actually traveled a lot. He has traveled as a person for over half a year, I think, through Brazil. 2 years ago, I think, and has been very widely perceived, just like necropolitics, cited by David, also by Achim Bembe. And Malcolm Ferdinand has his book published in Portuguese with a afterword by a Brazilian anthropologist. I put in the chat later. And there's a wonderful argument about Quilombo ecologies in this afterword. About actually how the Quilombo, the Maroon settlement, is actually a very diverse ecology of, indigenous, Afro-Brazilian, colonialists even merging, mixing with their ecologies, with the plants they brought and so on. So how this can also be, let's say, almost a vision, for a different kind of understanding of what a decolonial ecology can also be today or in the future. So I find that very interesting. Very interesting provocation. I don't want to solve it. I think there's still, lots of problematics in these travelings of species from one place to another. But I wanted to add these thoughts on how they connect to the planetary.
Thanks, Laura. Jamie, you want to jump in here in this point?
I would just add something quickly. I think it's maybe would be good to say that the seeds that were somehow circulated didn't end up in the seed bombs that the kids were using. So it's not that seeds from Germany were being seed bombed in Sao Paulo. So there was some level of responsibility that we took. The seed bombs were obviously constructed from seeds from the local areas. But I think, of course, we know that the real kind of problems here for the circulation of plants and of pathogens as well. This is another one of my fascinations, is the circulation of plant pathogens globally, is supply chains, is domestic kind of like greenhouse ornamental plant trade, and bigger kind of capitalist kind of production and circuits. Really, this is where this is becomes problematic. But I think the kind of query that Laura brings up about what these, of course, they're problematic on one hand because they can devastate kind of local ecosystems, but it's also a process that's been ongoing for a long time, and it's not something that we halt easily with boundaries and borders and red lines on maps and these things. It's shown that these kind of modern techniques of biosecurity don't really kind of hold against the spread of pathogens and plants and life, ultimately,
Thank you. At the moment, we don't have any questions from the floor, but please do feel free to raise them. We have 20 minutes left or so. I don't know, Lindsay, if you also feel like your questions have been sufficiently answered, or the themes that you'd like to bring in have been addressed.
Well, I just wanted to, it's not really a big question. The question of children in your projects. I'm interested to know how you access those children. The sort of ethical questions of working with children interest me, and what the children gained from engagement with the project.
That is a great question. Let's see who feels inclined to speak about this.
I could start how we work with children at Fordham University. It's a pity that Uta's not here because she is one of the main actors of the Kids Uni. So we have a whole faculty, more or less, dedicated to children. We discussed also a lot within the association if children should be part of every program. But we realized that they have, at some point, different needs, right, in creating program. And we have cooperations as well with school classes or with where children go after school, but also like free program where they are invited to experiment with topics around nature, but also the city. There's this whole project called Wasserkostbar, where there's a quiz part around water and also mixing. So there's, yeah, it's a pity that Uta's not here, but there's a playful way to bring the big questions to children. I think this is the way the Kids Uni is working. Yeah. Indira, maybe you would like to share?
I think a little bit from what also happened in Jakarta, because we also worked with children, and it's for us it's as simple as sharing curiosity. Sometimes we need to I don't know if it makes sense, recalibrate our thought about the environment around us, and it's sometimes it's very easy to work with children because they help us to formulate a simple but very fundamental question. Sometimes it not just for the children but also for us. For example, in Jakarta, we worked with the children to go have a little tour to the forest. And then this very simple question is actually a really important and big question. So we told them that there are monkeys in the forest, and they were really interested in that. And then, yeah, let's go and see the monkeys. And in the end, they didn't see the monkeys because, of course, it's hard to, like, children make noises and monkeys are afraid of noises. And there's this question, where are the monkeys? And that's a really simple, but also something very reflective for us. And it's also something that's we can share from Jakarta, from in Berlin, in Sao Paulo. It's a very simple question that we also can share. So it sometimes working with children bring us back to the very important and also very not primitive. How do I say it? It's just very instinctive question for us as human. I mean, I don't know if anyone think of something else.
Anna, you want to jump in?
Yes, it's a short note also, because I've been working with children too, with my students, and in a big slum here in Rio called Rocinha. And of course, it brings a lot of ethical questions. So we usually work with schools. So working, from the beginning with schools, I think that's very important. In the case of Bexiga, there was like an open call, and we worked with local children, a small group of local children. And of course, I think it has to do, with sharing also imaginaries, sharing perspectives, and also imaginary. So it's not, for me, it's not only what they learn, but what we learn from them. That's as important. It's very, very important that we open up our imaginary. Of course, we are talking about grounds, and so caring for the ground is also caring for the planet. But we are talking about political issues. We are talking about, bigger issues. So it's also important for me as an architecture professor to work with children, to talk to them, to practice ways of sharing perspectives, building new perspectives, to have new horizons. Because our planetary imaginary, our political imaginary, our design imaginary is very limited, I think, nowadays. So it's very, very important also to bring the children closer to our practices.
No, thanks. That's great. I mean, I think it was more about the ethical questions that you mentioned, Anna. And it's interesting that both Teresa and Anna have spoken about working through schools. You know, I mean, in our work with children in NO, we had to get parental consent forms. You know, there were a whole kinds of series of ethical questions. We were very careful about, you know, children really getting the project to the children of the fishing community, who are the most deprived children in the neighborhood. And the impacts of the projects on their lives have been quite enormous, actually, in terms of the confidence building and the kind of empowering of those children whom we worked with. But there are ethical issues that one has to be very careful about.
Laura, on this topic, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, just very quickly. I think it's important for us to keep this also noted or sedimenting also for future practices. I mean, each side, so that's how it came up, of course. Each side has a history of working with children beyond academia or independent from academia completely. No? So this is how we had an infrastructure from where it already built and from where Teresa's colleague Ute brought practices that we replicated in a way in Sao Paulo, and Indira also brought practices from different activities that they did in the past and are doing now in LabTech in Jakarta. But as soon as you build a longer project, and particularly also academic practice project, these questions become super relevant. But I also wanted to share from this empowering aspect and how it actually, so two things. So one, how it informed really design practices that we develop as a project in an incredible way, and also how situations of empowerment became very materialized in a very incredible way. So Ute, I remember, brought stories from Berlin to Sao Paulo. That was one thing that happened. And I was put in the role because in that situation, I was the only one to speak German and Portuguese. So I was actually translating a letter that a kid from Berlin wrote at a little workshop we did, where we also mixed waters, where we also then went through the neighborhood and offered the water mixes of the three sites to people. And the children, of course, had no hesitation in tasting. And, you know, so the whole sensual experience was incredible. But also this train of thought that happened when I was trying to translate. I didn't read the letter before, so I had to translate in the moment the letter from German to Portuguese, and the children were painting while it happened. So the paintings that I showed before, these were again another remixing, as Jamie called it in the beginning, when they traveled back to Berlin. But I mean, we can learn so much in terms of, you know, storytelling, restorying, visualizing, as Indira said, in a much more, you know, less maybe abstracted way, you know. This is something I really enjoyed about this experience, me probably having the least experience with working with children in my academic practice. And then we did this event at one of these museums, and what we had been doing before is also telling a story while playing drums, actually, relating also to the Afro Brazilian history of the river. And the drum was representing the river that didn't talk anymore, so it stopped at some point, and then we had to make it talk again. And we had a lot of help with the masks and the seed bombs and so on. And I think this was a very strong, where the children really became, you know, like the main actors, protagonists of really making this tambor, this drum talk again. And then we did this public event, and the children, some of the children were also present with their parents. And then one of the parents was talking, actually, the local Candomblé territory, how do you say, Mighty Santo, no? I can't translate it now, but the authority of the local candomblé community. And her child just went to the stage and took the microphone and started to tell the story of took over completely the event. It was like a very, I mean, it was in a museum, but still was quite framed and not very, like there was still an academic event in a way, and the child didn't have any problems with coming to the stage and talk. So I really like this moment. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Laura. And I wonder, this notion of children's imagination also, as Anna had mentioned, allows us to circle back to design, and in these last minutes to maybe wrap up with this where we started from, designing with the planet. If we can find ways in which we can answer that question. I mean, we've done that for the last 2 hours, more or less. But I'd like to give Lindsay the word, perhaps as a respondent, to let us know if you feel your questions have been addressed, if you feel designing with the planet is something that has a clarity. So we know what that looks like now after this discussion.
Thanks, Kenny. I'll try, but maybe others would also like to chip in here. I think maybe the answer lies actually in the fact that we haven't really talked about the South in this discussion yet. And I'd like to go back to something Laura said right at the beginning. She's the only one really who talked about the South, was this idea of the South as being a politics of the earth. And to me, I mean, what I've learned from what you've been talking about, I mean, David spoke about, oh no, I think it was Anna, spoke about struggles always being struggles over land and for land. But land is more than just land. It's water, it's air, it's culture, it's ways of life. And, if that's what we're designing with, then I think we are designing with the planet. And it is it's a politics of design that I think you guys are all trying to develop in experimental ways, which is also really important. I see your project as very experimental. And Jamie, also the way you articulated certain key words in your input and the sort of design tactics that this experiment is producing, which I think can arguably be a kind of politics and design of and with the earth, which I think is really groundbreaking. And I'd really like you to develop those ideas, both academically and also in practice. Because I think there's something there that's really important to learn about how to humble yourself to the earth, actually, and people who are struggling for land, and to offer, these humble tactics, I think, that could dramatically change people's lives. So for me, that's the strength of your project and what you're trying to do. And I'm sure some of it doesn't work. Experiments often go wrong, but we learn from that as much as we learn from when they go right,
Thank you so much. I think that's a beautiful wrap up, and also one that leads to further questions. We could be talking about a lot, experimentation being one of them. I believe Jamie and Laura have something to say about that, as they just launched a special issue on that very topic.
Yes, we could say something about that and plug our special issue, with which Kenny and Laura will be participating in. But also I wanted to slip in one other word and thank Lindsay again for her wonderful provocations, feedback and thoughts. And this has been really, really productive. And, this is a really good time for us as well, because we're sort of starting to think about the close of this phase of the project, perhaps, and then thinking about what the second phase might be and what some of these how we might begin to wrap them up. But one of the things that I'll certainly be taking away with me is this thought that you had earlier, Lindsay, which was about the planetary not about scale, but as a process. And I think this is another thing about we can take about designing with the planet, how we design with the contingencies that the planet kind of throws up to us, and the kind of the way that I think it was Anne-Marie Willis talked about or Tony Fry, when we design the world designs back. And I love this idea of this kind of like this dialectical relational kind of movement between design tactics and the kind of contingencies that we have to kind of work with. So that's yeah, wonderful thought for us. Thank you very much.
That's great. Fantastic. Yeah, the planet designs itself all the time, and it throws you curveballs, and you know, it's not always friendly. And yeah, anyway, that's fantastic.
Thank you so much. Anybody else who would like to say a few concluding words, some takeaways or thank yous? Other than that, it is
I would like to say thank you, Kenny and Laura, for insisting that I do this when I let you down last time. And it's been great. I've learned a lot, and it's been really enjoyable. So thank you for bringing me into this conversation in this way.
Thank you so much for joining, for responding, for really also taking serious and engaging in depth with this experimental practice across planetary sites. It's been really wonderful to learn from that. So a big thank you also on behalf of Laura and myself to everybody for participating, for making this a lively and productive discussion. To end, maybe we can look to the next and perhaps final event of the series, which is a conversation between Caribe Muto Collective and Andrea Ballestero. We don't have a date for that yet. This was supposed to take place about a week and a half ago. Yes, but of course we'll be letting everybody know as soon as we have a date for that. Laura, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I'm just left to close and to say thank you to everybody, and to just say that if you want to revisit this conversation, it will be live on our Critical Urbanism's YouTube channel. So you can also send this link around to people who might want to revisit this conversation who couldn't make it today. And yeah, keep your eyes peeled on our social media, and also the social media of our media partners at COSARC, who will be broadcasting the dates for our next events. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.